This is the Snackable GRE Podcast. Welcome to the Snackable GRE Podcast, Episode 4 by Zeman Review. In this lesson, we will be discussing how to identify and use assumptions for critical reasoning questions on the GRE. We will wrap up with our word of the day. An assumption is something that is unstated, in other words, not written in the argument. But if it's not written on the exam, can it really be important? Absolutely. There are a few types of critical reasoning questions in which finding assumptions are the key to solving. The main ones either ask you explicitly to identify the assumption, or they ask you to strengthen or weaken the argument. The strengthen and weaken questions are basically another form of identify the assumption questions, but you go one step further. Okay, let's start with how you identify assumptions in the first place. Before we identify assumptions, we first need to understand the argument. The arguments are short. Read them fully first and then note down any of the evidence or premises you can find. A premise is either a fact or a line of reasoning given to support the argument. You can think of a premise as like an assumption that is stated. You also want to figure out the conclusion or main point of the argument. After that, think about what must be true but unstated for the author to arrive at that conclusion. You can ask yourself if there is anything missing between the stated evidence or premises and the conclusion, or if the author is taking anything for granted. In other words, there are reasons that the author might well assume true and doesn't question. Try to spot any gaps in the reasoning as well. Is there a step missing? Critical reasoning passages are supposed to be ironclad logical arguments similar to an algebra problem. If there's a step missing, that's an assumption. Your job is to bridge the gap when finding assumptions. Unsure if something is an assumption or not? We use something called the negation test. If you negate something unstated and the argument falls apart, then that unstated thing is an assumption the author is using. There are also a few traps you want to avoid. One is called scope shift. That means the argument makes a statement or fact about X, but then applies that reasoning to Y. But of course, just because something is true for X doesn't mean that it must also be true for Y without additional proof. A second trap is assuming causation. The argument might link together a cause and effect, but again, that causation needs proof, not a simple statement. Finally, there's the overgeneralization trap. This means that something can be proved for a specific example, but that doesn't mean that it applies in general. In other words, a true fact about a subset doesn't prove the same fact for the universe. So let's look at an example. A recent study found that students who attend smaller schools perform better on standardized tests than students in larger schools. Therefore, reducing the size of schools will improve students' performance. Which of the following is an assumption used to support the author's conclusion? A. Larger schools spend less budget per student than smaller schools. B. A higher percentage of private schools are classified as smaller schools. C. Smaller schools have a lower absentee rate. D. Small and large schools have comparable teacher quality, funding per student, and demographics. Or E. Large schools tend to be in urban areas and small schools in rural areas. So, what do you think? Well, the author claims that reducing the size of a school will improve student performance because smaller schools have higher standardized test scores. For this to be true, Small and large schools would have to be similar on every other meaningful factor besides size. Think of the choices again. A, if larger schools spend less per student, would reducing the size help? Maybe not. We're told that if a school size were reduced, then the spending would increase. That rate might not stay the same. Okay, so B, more private schools are small than large. Well, so what, right? We're given no facts as to whether private schools have better performance, so we can't pick it. It's kind of like a circular argument. C, smaller schools have lower absentees. Again, sounds good, but there are no facts to support it in the passage. Without the internal facts, you can't use it. D, small and large schools are similar in terms of teacher quality, funding, and demographics. Yes, this is what we were saying earlier. They would have to be similar for everything else if simply changing class size would change the results. But lastly, let's look at E. More large schools are in urban areas. Again, we don't know anything about urban and rural differences in performance, so you can't pick it. Go with D. That's the answer choice. If you're still not convinced, try the negation test. So think if small and large schools had different teacher quality, different funding per student, and different demographics, then would we be able to say that school size is what causes the differences in performance? No, because now we're thinking of several factors that are different, meaning any of them or a combination of them could impact the performance. If we were asked a strengthen argument question instead, then we would strengthen it by this if we knew that everything in D were true. Now it's time for our word of the day. The word is insidious. Insidious means deceitful and cunning. It can be an ambush or a sneaky act. Insidious can refer to something that spreads under the radar in a hidden and harmful way. Insidious can be something intended to entrap another. Synonyms of insidious are pernicious and virulent. Let's use it in a sentence. The following is a quote from Night by Elie Wiesel. And action is the only remedy to indifference, the most insidious danger of all. This is a short but chilling line describing the conditions that preceded the Holocaust. Elie Wiesel lived through the concentration camps, and here he's letting us know how he thinks something that horrific could happen. Simply, indifference is insidious. It was the indifference, the lack of action of the people that let them be treated the way that they were. The indifference was an insidious danger because it starts with small things like not caring about wearing a gold star to more severe fates. That trajectory is harmful while also secretive. It's pernicious and virulent. It's insidious. That does it for today's lesson. Thanks for listening.